Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deep Dive, Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast. We have a very special episode today. We are about an hour and a half post-trade deadline. RJ has spoken with General Manager Ron Francis. We're going to be going over the moves that the Kraken made, the moves the Kraken didn't make, and the moves that the teams in the playoff race alongside the Kraken made today and really this past week leading up to the trade deadline. So exciting stuff to talk about on this episode of the Deep Dive. Of course, though, going to start off thanking Queen Anne Beer Hall for sponsoring this podcast. Like they do every week. Love what they do. If you need a place to go and celebrate the moves made, deal with the fact that some other moves weren't made, just have a good time. Queen Anne Beer Hall, both of their wonderful locations is there. And also want to remind everybody that over at our Patreon, patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, this upcoming Sunday, the 10th at 7 p.m., RJ will be doing his Armchair GM stream. So if you have any questions about moves the Kraken made, moves the Kraken didn't make, want to, say, hey, could they have been in on this guy? That is the time where you can do all that stuff with RJ over there again at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey. So looking forward to that one. That should be a pretty good one, RJ, I would say.
Oh yeah, definitely. Looking forward to breaking all this stuff down. I mean, with all the stuff going on today, I was just thinking, can't wait to talk about it on the Armchair GM stream.
Exactly. So let's go ahead and get into the stuff that happened, RJ, and we'll start off with, the extension that was signed this morning with Jordan Eberly with the Kraken, 2 years at 4.75 per, RJ.
That's right. So that was the one bit of business the Kraken did do today. It was kind of a quiet day otherwise for them, but they did re-sign Jordan Eberly. And now there were reports out there that it was kind of a big decision point, right? That either they were going to extend him or they're going to trade him today. And it is the extension. We kind of figured that's the way it was going to lean, Dylan. I don't know about you, but I kind of thought this deal was going to get done all along. Now, the reports were that the Kraken wanted a 2-year deal. Eberly wanted a 3-year deal, and so term was kind of the sticking point, maybe why it took this long to get to this point where they can agree on an extension. Sounds like Francis really held his ground as far as term, but the money was a little bit higher than the rumored 4.5. All in all, I think kind of a fair deal negotiation-wide for both sides.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm glad. I think the term was really what was more concerning to both of us when we had talked about this on the last episode of the Deep Dive. So I think standing firm on the 2-year term is appropriate given, where Ebbs is at in his career right now. I think that's what makes a lot of sense there. And, for me, the cap hit, it's still a cut from what he's making now. And with the salary cap rising each of the next 2 off seasons, I don't think that it's really going to be that big a deal.
Right. Well, I mean, that's where I might disagree with you a little bit as far as the big picture long term, but I do think this is a fair contract. Look, it's fair value, probably a little bit less than what he could get on the open market. Certainly, I think there might be a team that would offer him a 3-year deal at a number like this, but Francis was able to kind of bring that term down. Where I have concerns about this is just in the bigger picture long term, where now you have your top 9 forwards pretty much locked up or basically penciled in for next year, either under contract or RFAs like a Matty Beniers or an Eeli Tolvanen, who we think those guys are probably coming back. And so it kind of limits what you can potentially do as far as the big addition that you need to make scoring wise. With that 4.75 number, you have basically, I ran the numbers, about $8.4 million in cap space. And of course, I'll go over this more on the Armchair GM stream, but that's not quite enough to be in the conversation for, say, a Gensel or a Reinhardt if you do want to go in that direction. And then also I'm concerned about, even though the 2-year term is kind of ideal as far as what you could do, next year when you basically have to rebuild your entire blue line, having that money on the books could be money you don't get to spend on your blue line, given that guys like Larson is going to need a raise, Borgen probably going to need a raise if you keep him around, or having to bring in another blue liner as well. So it limits flexibility for me in a way that I'm not entirely comfortable with, even though I have to admit the deal is fair.
Yeah, and I think as we talked about last week with him, especially as he's coming up on game 1,000, he's 2 games away. There's an element of also, I mean, the fans really wanted him to stay. That was overwhelming, like sure. On Twitter, as the idea of him being moved was floated around. it's clear Seattle Kraken fans wanted Jordan Eberly as much as Jordan Eberly wanted to stay here. I mean, I really think Jordan Eberly wanted to get something done with the Kraken and stay here. I believe him when he talks about him and his family really feeling a part of this community, wanting to be in the city of Seattle. And I think the fans really wanted him around. So I do think there is a benefit to having him around in that regard. I think he's probably capable of bouncing back for another 20-goal season next year too, before the aging curve really starts hammering him. His shooting percentage this year is, I mean, it's 2 percentage points below his career average. I don't know that that's just age. I think some of that has just been some poor luck this season, as many members of the Kraken have had. So I think he'll still be able to contribute in a decent way. For me, it's the roster and lineup flexibility that you're losing that's more of a concern than even the cap hit, personally, just because, like you said, I mean, your top 9 is like kind of locked in. If you go out there and you do add somebody has to have, get pushed down to the 4th line. That probably doesn't belong there. It's kind of the same issue the Kraken have been dealing with this year, whether it's Andrei Burakovsky or Tomas Tatar or whoever it has been. You need to have people buried down on this lineup in a way that ultimately probably isn't best for them or the team.
Right. And it's going to create an uncomfortable situation there, if and when that happens. And as we see this year, you think at least with a bunch of guys in that range, right? Well, somebody's going to be scoring at any given time. And so it'll be okay. But as we found out at stretches this season, that's not always the case. You can have a lot of mid-level guys and turns out nobody's going at any given time. So it seems like it's kind of on the path to running it back with more mid-level forwards. And that's what concerns me. It's not necessarily Eberly specific that's the problem. It's just that group in general.
Yes. And yeah, we'll see what they end up doing in the offseason with the space that they have available. Obviously there's extensions and stuff that need to get done before then with guys like Matty Beniers, Eeli Tolvanen. We shall see. The one big deal though that the Kraken did make, RJ, is they kind of made the call to be sellers at the deadline, or at least that's what they had indicated when they sat Alexander Wennberg and held him out of their 2 games earlier this week for trade-related reasons, was to move Alexander Wennberg, right? He was held out of those games. They did end up ultimately moving him, and he was moved to the New York Rangers, one of the teams that he was heavily rumored to be involved with going to.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of people saw this deal coming a mile away, just given how much Wennberg's name was linked to the Rangers. He does end up going there. I think it's probably one of the preferred destinations for him. I know he did have some trade protection as well. Ron Francis likes to send guys, where they want to go. As for the return, because the Kraken, they retain 50% on Wennberg. They send him to the Rangers, and coming back, they get the Rangers' 2nd round pick this year, and I believe it's the Stars' 4th round pick in 2025. Mm-hmm. So 2nd and a 4th. Last week we talked about potential returns for Wennberg. I know we were hoping for something in the range of a 1st round pick. I mean, that was kind of the hope given what guys like Sean Monahan had gone for. There was another center that went for a 1st whose name I'm blanking on right
Lindholm.
now. Yeah, Lindholm had a bigger return than that, but I think there was one more as well. And Henrique, there was a first comeback for Henrique. That was the other one.
Yeah.
So, but look, I mean, when you take a step back and look, I do think a 1st was always a little ambitious for Wennberg, and I would have been really impressed if Francis had gotten that. Thought it might be possible, but ultimately this is a fair price for Wennberg. 2nd and a 4th, basically exactly what he's worth, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Certainly with the fact that he's going to be a UFA this year, and based on the reports of the Kraken really working on a contract extension with him, but it sounds like from Ron Francis that they weren't particularly close. They talked about it. I know other outlets have talked about it. This is like Wennberg's real chance to hit UFA as well. So you have to imagine any team he was going to go to, the idea of working out maybe a favorable extension with them probably wasn't going to be in the cards. So I think that lowers the return as well. New York really doesn't like to give up their 1st round picks, right? Chris Drury is just not on board with doing that. So I think this was the best given the circumstances. I do wonder though, RJ, because this market went from a seller's market to a buyer's market about halfway through yesterday, extremely fast. I do wonder if the Kraken were more on board with selling, say, a couple weeks ago, if things might have been different, if you might have been able to play Colorado, Edmonton, the Bruins, and the Rangers off each other and maybe gotten a 1st rounder from somebody.
I think it might have been possible too. And it's tough because the team still isn't really out of the playoff race, as we'll
Yeah.
get to later in the podcast. But Francis was kind of balancing those two things. And yeah, I think he may have been able to get a little bit more had he moved Wennberg sooner. But there is the trade-off of then he's out of your lineup. And so I understand him kind of wanting to get as many
Hmm.
games as possible with Wennberg in there. So I don't really fault him for that.
No, I don't either. I just wanted to bring it up because that was something that we expected this to be a seller's market all the way through, and it did not end up being that way at the end. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. The other thing that's kind of been talked about with this one, I mean, one, I think Wenberg's going to fit in very well with the Rangers. I think he's going to accent what they need and fill in that role for them extremely well. Fine with the 50% retention, all that stuff makes sense. The fourth round pick, though, this was something that was kind of fun as all the details of the trade were coming out. RJ's the condition on the fourth round pick from the Stars in the 2025 draft, because it's a condition that was put on when the Stars and the Rangers made a trade that now follows the pick over to the Seattle Kraken. And it's basically if Nils Lundqvist earns 55 cumulative points over last season and this season, the pick upgrades to Dallas's 2025 third round pick. Now, at the time of the trade, Lundqvist has had 31 points cumulative through those two seasons, which just plays out the rest of this year. But it was kind of fun, like learning that, because at first it was just the 55 points, RJ, but we didn't realize it was spread out over 2 years. So he was just sitting at 15 this year, and we were like, well, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, no, and it probably still will not happen.
No.
But I mean, somebody did, I see on Twitter, float a funny possibility of, hey, if the Kraken, when they play Lundqvist later this season, just let him score 24 points, and then boom, the pick goes higher.
Yeah, somebody on Discord, I believe it's Lindsay. I feel okay throwing Lindsay's name out there. Said just pull the goalie whenever he's on the ice. If we're not still in it, just pull the goalie. It's fine.
Play the long game.
Exactly. But yeah, I think this is a good return. The second round pick for the Kraken, I mean, right, let's look at where that puts them now. They have 2 second rounders this year. They have their own first rounder. They have 2 third rounders as well. So, I mean, it puts them in a spot, RJ, where this offseason they can either continue to add to their pretty deep prospect pool, or I also wonder, it gives them the ammunition to, if they want to, in the first round, maybe move up a little, maybe package some stuff and get a second first rounder this year. It does put them in a nice spot to maybe start making some moves.
Right. And this morning, this afternoon, Ron Francis did mention the possibility of kind of treating this offseason a little bit like that one from year 1 to year 2, where you take some of those surplus assets and kind of turn them around to get more help, more immediate help on the roster. And so I thought that was interesting to hear from him as well. Of course, didn't say that's what we're going to do or commit to it or anything, because he's an NHL GM. But, the fact that he brought it up, I thought was interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, that's basically all there is on the Wennberg deal. We knew Wennberg was going to, probably not come back next year anyway, just with Shane Wright coming in. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about on that end?
No, not really. Just that it makes the most sense, right?
Yeah.
This spot we know is going to be replaced next year, and France is already focused on that. And best of luck to him with the Rangers. Like you said earlier, I think he's going to be a great fit. He's playing on their third line. I'm looking at the line rushes right now. Mm-hmm. That's exactly the spot for him.
Exactly. So, good luck to Wenny, and then onto the deals, RJ, that the Kraken didn't make. Right, that maybe we were anticipating in the first place to start off with is Justin Schultz is still part of the roster. He made it through the trade deadline. I'm pretty surprised.
Yeah, I'm surprised as well, especially with Cale Fleury being called up earlier today. Thought that might be the precursor to a Justin Schultz trade. Did ask Francis about that after the deadline, and he kind of sidestepped saying anything directly. Of course, you don't want to imply that we had a trade for Schultz in the works, but fell through for whatever reason. But he said it was basically based on Dunn, the fact that they weren't sure if he's going to play tonight. Turns out he will not play tonight, but that if something were to happen, Dunn couldn't go. If something were to happen to the blue line, I think that means a Schultz trade. Then they'd only have 5 defensemen. You can't be left with 5 defensemen. So it sounds like it was at least a possibility today, but I'm guessing, he had an asking price out there. Teams didn't meet it, and, he stays a Kraken.
Yeah, and that is kind of the thing that I'm curious about, is how far along the Kraken might have been in trade talks with teams around him, because I don't remember his name popping up for any of the insiders really at all
Nobody
through this
mentioned
whole
him.
process. Yeah, like there was no rumors going around, which seems odd to me just because at the deadline every year, RJ, I mean, defensemen, that's a big time commodity. We see them moved. We saw defensemen move today and yesterday and all through the week. For him not to even be in any rumors, to not have his name mentioned at all, was very, very surprising to me, and it does make me wonder how maybe active the Kraken were at trying to shop him.
Right. I mean, I think that I'm obviously Ron France is always listening. I'm sure he
Mm-hmm.
had teams coming to him. I'm sure he listened to offers. To me, it seems like if you look at the other deals that were made around the deadline, you had like Colin Miller, who I remember you were saying Colin Miller was kind of the answer, the guy you wanted the Kraken to
Yeah.
sign when they did sign Justin Schultz. Pretty comparable players. He goes for a fourth round pick. You had a guy like Chad Ruedel go for a fourth round pick. I feel like that's you had Dumba go for a little less than a fifth. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that's probably the price that you're looking at for a
Yeah.
Schultz. And I think I said earlier too, a second rounder would be nice. A third rounder is fine, is fair. You make that deal. When a fourth rounder, I guess Eric Johnson also going for a fourth round pick. I think Schultz is a little better than that, but generally that's probably the price. And I feel like maybe if you hold out for a third, that might be what I would be tempted to do. And if you can't get it, if you're one of those GMs, it's like, well, I'd rather, hold out, keep my guy, especially if Dunn's out for a little while, than kind of give in and take a lower price.
That was the question that I was going to have, is that the market really turned sour against defensemen. Like the ones that were moved for not much, right? I mean, we're talking late round picks essentially. And so I was wondering, I wonder if that was just what the offers coming in was. And if it was that situation where Ron Francis had a higher price in mind and just wanted to hold out for it, in which case, are you good with that? I mean, are you fine with that? Or are you like, well, look, we're just going to watch him walk in the offseason anyway. That spot needs to open up for Riker Evans regardless. This kind of makes it difficult if Dunn is to come back sooner rather than later. The situation around Riker Evans becomes a bigger question mark, for the rest of this season. Like, are you on board with kind of holding the line, demanding a third or maybe even a fourth that nobody was willing to give, and going through all of those other things, or would you rather just have the asset?
If it's a third, I'd rather have the asset. I think if he was offered a third, you absolutely needed to do that. But if it was a fourth, which, looking at the rest of the market, that wouldn't surprise me.
Let's say he was only offered a fifth based on the market.
Oh, then you hang on to him. Then you hang on to him for sure. Just because, I mean, I look at it the other way, right? Assuming like as if he's not on your team, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're still in, a position where depending on the odds, depending on the website, or the model, right? You're 20 to 33%, right? Chance for a playoff spot. Like spending a fifth rounder on a rental defenseman like that, I think that's, a fine move to make. You saw other teams that were kind of on the bubble bringing guys for maybe a similar price, not selling the farm or anything. So I look at it the other way. I think, basically he's your own rental. He cost, let's say, a fourth or a fifth round pick. I'm okay with the price for that.
Okay. And then do we think that this means Riker Evans to Coachella Valley when Vince Dunn comes back?
I think so, and everybody's healthy. And so Francis did get asked about that, the Riker Evans situation, given that he sat for so long. And, Francis did say the most important thing is to get him in games. He needs to get in games. He needs to play. And he said also he's ready. Like he showed the other night, he's ready for the NHL level. He's NHL caliber. But, if everybody's healthy, he said, he will get him into games in the NHL while Dunn's out. And then, if the games don't materialize at the NHL level, then we'll send him to Coachella Valley and get him games there. So it sounds like post deadline, the plan is to get Riker Evans into games, whether it's in Seattle or in Coachella Valley.
Yeah, and that's what I had talked about whenever this question had kind of come up. If you didn't move Schultz at the deadline, which they didn't, Riker has to, if he's not going to be playing at the NHL level, he's got to go back to Coachella Valley. You got to get him in games. It doesn't make sense to sit him. And also, I mean, especially now with the NHL experience he has, he's going to be such a benefit to the Firebirds as they go on their playoff run at the AHL level. Like he's going to be really good there. So that makes sense there. Especially makes sense with the Fleury call up today, because I think they did a paper transaction with Riker to have him go back to the AHL for today. in
Yeah,
quotes go
I'll
there.
explain. Yeah, and quickly I'll explain how that works because I'm sure a lot of people saw that and were wondering what was up with that. So basically, in order to be eligible for the AHL playoffs, you have to be on an AHL roster at the time of the trade deadline. And so, what teams will do, like say with a Riker Evans, who was at KCI this morning, morning skate with the team, all that stuff, is they will do what's called a paper transaction. They'll send him down to the Firebirds again, just on paper. Let that deadline pass so he's eligible, and then call him right back up to the Kraken. And I expect him to play tonight. So he didn't go anywhere, but that's basically how it works. It just gets him AHL playoff eligibility.
And I assume the call up for Cale Fleury was around that as well.
Yeah, I think it was around that. Let me check the AHL transaction log to make sure that to see if he's been sent back down or what, because now they don't really need him given that Schultz didn't move.
Right. Well, that's what I was thinking, and it was another thing that I was curious about because I was like, well, obviously the Fleury call up was announced prior to the deadline, which would mean he wasn't on the roster at deadline time, which would mean what? They're just not going to have Cale Fleury available for the Firebirds run, which would be odd to me. So that's why I'm bringing it up.
Well, I think they sent him down before the deadline.
Okay.
Again, like
yeah. Well, that's what they should have done. I just hadn't seen anything about that because the deadline happens and that's all anybody's talking about.
Right.
So, yeah. So that's
I see
that's
both on the transaction log, but it just has a date, not a time. So
yeah, I would imagine that's what they did. I can't imagine. It doesn't make sense to do anything else there. So
yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Anything else on the Schultz situation? I mean, again, I'm kind of surprised. I'm really just mostly surprised that it wasn't ever really talked about. Like, and again, that doesn't mean Ron Francis wasn't actively involved with teams and doing this. It just means that it wasn't as many of these defensive moves ended up being. They weren't as high profile as maybe they normally are at the trade deadline.
Right. I mean, I don't have anything official to go on, but I bet there were discussions about Schultz and the Fleury call up. That's what tells me is because I think if you had made the decision ahead of today that you were hanging on to Schultz, there's no need to call up Cale Fleury.
Right.
I mean, unless there's some injury on the blue line we don't know about, which is a possibility. If one of those other guys is potentially hurt and you don't have Dunn, but I just think there's no other reason to do that. So I think there were probably conversations had about Justin Schultz.
Yeah. And then the I guess the last name that had been kind of talked about going into the trade deadline. Well, I guess there's two names still, but Tomas Tatar, upcoming UFA, there was the idea that maybe he would be on the block. Again, I don't remember hearing anything about him with anybody. I don't know if there was going to be any movement on there. I don't know if you heard anything.
No, I didn't. Aside from just that they might be looking to flip him, but there were no teams that he was ever linked to. I don't think that ended up getting very far. Again, you look at how it became so much of a buyer's market later on, especially today. I can't imagine the price for Tatar would be anything higher than what the Kraken paid earlier this season. Yeah. And at that point, especially since you've gotten rid of Wennberg, it just doesn't make sense to move him. No,
not with the position the Kraken are in, which again we're getting to. And then I guess the other one was just because this Monday it was the story was the idea that Brandon Tanev, was maybe being discussed. But again, outside of that on Monday, I don't remember seeing anything else pop up all week.
No, and I don't think there was anything probably too serious with that. And again, if you're an acquiring team, if you're somebody who's looking, hey, I might be interested in Brandon Tanev, why would you ever really pursue that deal given the price for rental forwards at this deadline, right? I mean, you could go out and get somebody at that level or better for probably less than you'd have to pay to acquire a guy with term like a Brandon Tanev, especially from a team like the Kraken who are in no rush to make a deal. He's not a pending UFA. They don't have any need to do anything unless you knock their socks off. So I'd imagine that's probably why it didn't come together.
Yes, I agree there. And then, so those are the deals that the Kraken didn't make on their side as far as selling. Let's talk about the deals that maybe they didn't make in terms of acquiring people, just because the Kraken find themselves in a spot where they're just a few points, a couple games out of a playoff spot. They won those 2 games earlier this week, right after we had kind of said we think they're done. They go off and they win a couple games. They put themselves right back into the thick of things. And there's a couple names that were moved, RJ, that I just want to bring up and get your opinion on. As of whether or not the Kraken should have been involved on these. And I know let's start with the one who was moved that we knew was most likely going to be moved, and that's Jake Guentzel. We've talked about Jake Guentzel in the past, all of that stuff, but after seeing what he actually was moved for from Pittsburgh to Carolina. Do you think the Kraken should have been involved in that, just because that package, at least for me, was surprisingly small going back to Pittsburgh? I mean, it's prospects. It's like a second that could turn into a first, but most likely won't. And Michael Bunting. Like, that was kind of
Right.
it.
Yeah, and I think you're not the only one who was kind of surprised by how small that return was given the situation, right? Now, I mean, this package too is the one that I feel like the Kraken would be in the best position to potentially match, because it's three basically second round prospects, or two.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, two second round prospects, a fourth round prospect. The Kraken have a bunch of those. You know, they've
Yep.
got guys like, Jagger Furcus, Yanni Newman. They have those second round prospects. A conditional second round pick, a fifth round pick. Kraken, have that to potentially match it. And then you just pick a roster player to take Bunting's spot. I don't think that's, really the guy who made the deal. It's something they could have matched. I still don't think, without an extension for Gensel, I don't think it's the wise thing to do, because you don't want to just load up with a rental for this kind of playoff run. And the fact, if you could lose him for nothing in the offseason, I don't think it's worth giving up even that kind of value just to get a guy like that for a run where you're still, chances are you're not going to make the playoffs. So I have no problem with not being involved there. But man, if the Kraken just 5 or 6 more points in the standings than what they have right now, I'd say maybe they should be in on that sort of thing. Because also, I feel like I'd like their chances to maybe be able to sign him to an extension.
I would too. I mean, just because everybody who's come through Seattle basically has been like, yeah, it's fantastic, right? Like, they want to stay there. I feel like the Kraken could put together something around that, and the fact that he'd be able to play with a good young player in Matty Beniers, good young player in Shane Wright moving forward. I could see them being able to maybe put together an extension, just having had him in the building for a couple months. I'm with you. If the Kraken were in LA, Vegas, even Nashville spot where you have a couple points of a cushion and you're in the playoffs, I think then it would be more so like, okay, let's look for it. But I don't know. Without him having term, I don't know that it makes sense for the Kraken to kind of deplete their prospect pool for somebody, given their window is not really now. Right? Carolina, it makes sense. Their window is right now. They need to find a way to kind of break through to the next level in the postseason. Kraken aren't there yet. And so it just didn't really make sense. But I just know that return was kind of smaller than what was anticipated, and he was a guy a lot of Kraken fans were talking about, so we needed to talk about it. The other one being kind of a surprise, although you and I have talked about him, RJ, as somebody that maybe the Kraken should be interested in, as they search for a star level player, at least a productive player on the score sheet, whether it's goals or points, and that's Tomas Hertl, who was ended up being moved from the San Jose Sharks to the Vegas Golden Knights. Bigger package here involved. I mean, this one would have been pretty tough for the Kraken to beat, I think. The Sharks getting back David Enstrom, who was a Vegas first-round pick a couple years ago, and then a first-round pick from Vegas in 2025. So the Kraken would have really had to pony up the assets there to bring in Tomas Hertl. But I mean, RJ, he's a fantastic player, and he's kind of what the Kraken need, is just, this guy who can come in, kind of consistently put up points, put up goals. It's why we've talked about him in the past.
Right. I mean, the on-ice fit is certainly there. I mean, a guy who, especially with his size, can drive to the net, play big, play physical in a way that not a lot of Kraken players are equipped to do. There's really nobody on the Kraken that is built like Hertl and uses their size like Hertl. So, yeah, I mean, fantastic player there. Obvious downside is, the knee injuries, of which he's dealing with one right now.
Yeah.
So he still isn't healthy at the moment. Should be back in the regular season, though. But that's a long-term thing. That's been a lingering thing. He's had a history in his career of knee injuries, so there's an element of risk associated with that. And then, of course, with his contract, where he has 6 years after this one on the deal, and he's 30 years old, so you're getting a guy who's really kind of fits more of a now window than a later window that you might be looking at otherwise. But on the plus side, though, is the cap hit, where Vegas got San Jose to retain 17%, making Hertl a $6.75 million player. And when he's healthy, he is an absolute bargain for that price. And, I'm sure that was key to the whole deal and why the return was so high. Dylan, given the return, though, do you think this kind of deal is even something the Kraken could have matched or been in on?
I mean, look, they Could they have matched it? Yes, but it would have taken what, Shane Wright and a pick, right? Maybe you don't then have to give up a
Riker
second
Evans.
first per se, but yeah, Riker Evans or Shane Wright would have to be like the comparable prospect, and then you're looking at maybe a first or a first a year or so from now. I don't know that makes sense for the Kraken, right? Like certainly not for Tomas Hertl, given his age, the injury history, the length of term left on his contract, all of those things. I feel like that doesn't. Again, the Kraken weren't the right team, right? Like it makes sense for Vegas. They are very much in their now window. They can afford to take all that on. It makes sense for them. Just like with Gensel and Carolina, it makes sense for them. Neither of these deals really seem to make sense for the Kraken. Where the Kraken are at right now as a team struggling to find a playoff spot, as a team that has a lot of options open to them moving forward, and you have to kind of figure out who is part of your core and where they're all going to fit in before you can start making big additions one at a time to kind of plug holes along the way. So I just don't feel like it was the kind of right deal for the Kraken to be in on anyway. But this is then my next question. Should we look at this and say, well, this is the model for when the Kraken have to maybe make a move for a star player, right? We've talked about this. If there is a surprise star player becomes available or something like that, this gives us an idea of what it's going to cost, right? Because if Tomas Hertl, with all those kind of potential red flags with his injury, with the contract and the length of term left on it, is still worthy of a first-round pick prospect and a first-round pick, gives a kind of an idea of should a Barzal or whoever becomes available, it's going to cost the farm, right? Like there's just no way around that for the Kraken. And so it's kind of an interesting one. Should over the offseason the Kraken want to make a move like this, it's going to cost a lot.
Right. I mean, you have to take risks to get the potential reward. And I mean, Vegas is kind of, the poster child for that, right? I mean, they take big swings all the time. They take huge risks, but you know what? They've paid off for them. And that's where you get to, I think, the difference between a team like Vegas and how they operate, and a difference in Seattle and how they operate. Like Ron Francis, he's the anti-Vegas as far as his philosophy toward these sorts of things, right? And that's where, for now, it's okay. As we just covered on these two potential trades that didn't happen for the Kraken, I'm okay with that. I think we both are, and that's the right way to approach this. But I think that philosophy, to an extent, has to go out the window this offseason because of the cap space that you've accumulated. It will be the time to go for it. We've covered this on past podcasts, and that's where, again, something like the Eberly extension, even though in a vacuum it's okay, that worries me a little bit because it's down to that philosophy. And I think Francis kind of, he joked about something his someone on his staff said, but I think it's really telling. He was asked today if he was generally happy with how the trade deadline went for him. And he said, I don't think we're in a position to start throwing firsts and seconds around, but as someone on my staff said, we didn't do anything stupid today. So I guess that's a positive. And I think that's kind of generally the philosophy around the team and the roster management is just don't do anything stupid. And that's fine. Of course, you don't want to do stupid things. That's obvious. But in the long run, and especially when you're in a position when you have cap space to work with, that's not good enough. It's not good enough to just not do anything stupid. You need to be taking advantage of the teams doing stupid things. And that's what Vegas is so good at. I mean, this move, I'll get into it on the Red Glare podcast tomorrow. Everybody, listen for my rant on that one. But this is a terrible move for San Jose, and I'll get into all the reasons why. Fantastic move for Vegas. You have to be opportunistic like that. And that's okay, treating it like this is the deadline the way the Kraken have. But this offseason, that has to change. You don't have to go all out and be Vegas and, wheel and deal and acquire, 5 different guys and stuff. But you have to change the philosophy just a little bit. I worry that, we're kind of headed along this same path because it's not going to work forever.
Yeah, well, and the other worry is just that even if the philosophy does change, what options are available to the Kraken in the offseason anyway? Right? Like you could have $20 million in cap space going into this offseason. There's like Jake Gensel, and that's about it. Right? Like this is the other thing we've talked about, is that it's unfortunate that right as the Kraken kind of position themselves to maybe be competitive and to, in free agency and to really also need to make a move, you're happening to hit one off season where there just isn't somebody there. And how unfortunate that kind of is, the timing of it all. But we have seen them take advantage of that situation in the past, right? The Oliver Bjorkstrand deal is one of those. I think you can look at the way they've negotiated extensions with Vince Dunn has kind of been that way, right? That number came in a lot lower than we thought, and the term is fantastic. Jared McCann, that extension is that way. And then, same offseason as the Oliver Bjorkstrand situation where you're able to take advantage of Columbus, running into cap problems. Andre Burakovsky, I know it's not the best deal in the world. It hasn't aged all that great, but that was a number that came in lower than expected with, again, not insane terms. So sometimes Ron Francis being a little bit more cautious has worked for him. He's been able to lure guys to Seattle, even though the results have been mixed. He hasn't been crazy, like too ultra conservative either.
I guess so. I mean, I'll give you the re-signings, but again, that's not enough to, it's about acquiring talent. Yeah, he's a re-sign ace. That's awesome. But, when it comes to acquiring high-end talent, like that's when you have to be prepared to maybe, give up more or take those bigger swings. And it's tough because a lot of these deals that, that I'm sure are never made, so we never know about. You never know the names that are floated out there, right? Like, who thought Tomas Hertl was going to be traded today? Nobody. Yeah. I was in the media room, and as soon as that broke, like we had 3 people just separately go, whoa. I mean, it was a bit of a surprise. And, I'm sure the Sharks weren't particularly like eager to move him, but I think Vegas offering that return, like, I think we have to do this. So it's that kind of stuff in the offseason. And when more names are floated in the offseason too, ones, we may not be thinking about right now or ever hear about, you have to at least be involved in those conversations.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I'm totally with you. I don't know that the Kraken have been in a position to do it yet. And unfortunately, I don't think this offseason, as I'm 1,000% with you, they absolutely need to this offseason. I just don't know that it's actually going to be there. That's the problem.
Yeah, and that's right. I can't point to anything specific and say, yeah, this is going to be there. This is the one you need to be in on, So I can't point to that. Although, in the past, Eichel, Chychrun.
Well, yes,
they've had the opportunity.
Yes, and we've both said they should have done that, right? You didn't have a team yet, and we were like,
and they weren't in on that.
Do Jack Eichel. The Chychrun run is still like inexcusable to me. That one I really don't understand, given how little he ended up going for. Other than Arizona was just for whatever reason needed as high a pick in that one particular draft as possible, and the Kraken weren't in a position to do that. It still just doesn't make sense. You could have given more picks in total, and I feel like that would have been better return for Arizona. But no, like I said, I'm with you. I just trying to temper expectations for this offseason because it's the worst offseason I could remember to potentially do this.
Yeah, again, you're not wrong about that. I'm thinking about, maybe it's the Eberly extension that just has me thinking in this mindset a little, and I need to kind of snap out of this, right? But I don't want to see this exact season happen again next year.
No, I don't think anybody does. And I think they'll be slightly better. I think having Shane Wright around might help some. Can't imagine that everybody's going to be shooting sub 10% that shot this year, so they're going to be slightly better. But I'm with you. I just don't know what's actually going to be available for them, who's going to be out there, what they're going to be potentially able to do, just because the free agent market already dried up. That's not usual. Yeah. Like, this is a weird situation.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the trade market. Free agent, any kind of big free agent signing Francis has attempted to do has gone poorly. So I'm not looking for that.
Well, I'm with you there. We've sat around both on the podcast and behind the scenes, RJ, right? And we've looked, and there's just not a ton of names. Like, this is the problem with the way the league is right now, is so many teams are kind of in the same position as the Kraken, where they are all, plus or minus 9 or 10 points from the playoffs, right? They're either barely in the playoffs or they're barely on the outside of it. And what that does is it puts a lot of teams in this spot where, especially, where it doesn't put teams, it puts general managers in a spot where if they want to protect and have their job, they can't just necessarily blow it up. And I think right now, having so many mid-level teams has just made it so that there's not as much action going on. There's not as many guys available that there otherwise normally would be in past seasons. And it's the frustrating part for me is just the fact that this happens to all time out exactly, at the worst moment for the Kraken, right? The Kraken finally put themselves in a situation where it really makes sense for them, and it's just the entire rest of the league seems to be in the same spot. And therefore it means, and you and I know this from fantasy football, from other things, it means nothing will happen. And that's just unfortunate.
Yeah, that does seem to be the way that GMs operate, except for in Vegas. That's like the only the team that really treats it that differently.
Yeah, well, but I mean, teams that are going to take the chance and just go ahead and say, you know what, we could be mid for the next 4 years, but let's just go ahead and rebuild while nobody else is, right? Like it's
Mhm.
all going to come down to which general manager has the job security and the go ahead from ownership to do that. And I don't know who that's really going to be.
Yeah,
Because that's what you need to look for. So
not
Kraken
Lou.
fans, let us know. No, I was gonna say Lou Lamoriello's not gonna do that. Unfortunately, he's the one that makes the most sense to. He will not do that with the Islanders. But I guess that's what I would ask Kraken fans is which team do you think is going to be in that situation where they can maybe go ahead and do something? Because we thought even a Travis Konechny was going to be available potentially. RJ say halfway through this year, but of course Philly ends up doing well, and then they're not in a position to get rid of him the way everybody thought they would be come mid-year, right? Like that's just the way this whole situation has gone, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so it might end up just turning into you wait early next season and see which team ends up taking a nosedive unexpectedly and
Yeah,
maybe has to move somebody.
right, and be ready, right? I think that's going to be more so the time
Yeah.
is not going to be the off season, it's going to be November. Right? What team finds themselves in a slow start, a death spiral, whatever? They need to make a trade to shake it up, even if they want to still be competitive that year. But I think November is really going to be more so the time where Ron Francis can then really get aggressive and try to go out there and do something. I just don't see it materializing during the offseason for really anybody.
Yeah, you might be right. But at that point, he better be knocking down doors.
Yep. Bring in Andrei Kuzmenko, RJ. Let's go.
uh,
That's what it'll be. That's what it's gonna be. Mark my words. All right. So there's that situation. Sorry to go on that tangent, everybody, but I think it matters. And then look, RJ. At the end of the day, here, where do the Kraken stand? Right? They're still on the outside of the playoff picture. You're still a couple games out, and we talked about Vegas acquiring Hurdle. They also acquired Noah Hannafin. They're one of the really realistically three teams you're chasing, right? Vegas, LA, Nashville. Those are the three teams in that conceivably could fall out and the Kraken could take their spot. Nashville made the move. They bring in Jason Zucker. LA didn't really make a move. It sounds like they were in on potentially getting Olmark, but that fell through. But where do the Kraken stand? Because they move out Alexander Wennberg. They don't add anybody. But Vegas definitely added some people. Nashville added somebody. I mean, does this bode well for the Kraken moving forward? I know they're playing better right now, but it's not great when the teams you're having to try to chase and catch up to get better.
No, and the Kraken are playing well, but everything around them seems to be going wrong here, at least recently. I mean, Nashville just they don't lose. They won again. Look, the Kraken didn't get any help yesterday. Nashville wins. LA wins. I mean, Vegas is the only team kind of left down there. I guess that's the one bit of help they got, but they've loaded up so much. I mean, adding Mantha, Hannafin, and now Hurdle. You're 6 points back of Vegas with a game in hand. Like, again, that looks reasonable on the surface, but this is a different Golden Knights team now, post deadline. I still think, I don't know, Dylan, who's the most reasonable target, LA or Nashville? Like, you still have 2 games in hand on Nashville. That's going to help you, but they seem a lot hotter than LA right now.
Yeah, I mean, Nashville 9-0-1 in their last 10. You figure that can't continue the rest of the way, but if it continues just half of the way, it's too much, right? Like that's the problem is that this could go on for another 5 games. They just rattle off another 5 wins before maybe cooling off. But if at that point it'll be too much probably if they just stay 500. I don't know. I that being said, I still think they're probably the best bet, right? Like LA's got the same amount of games as you, but you're 8 points behind them. And again, you're not going to have the tiebreaker, so you got to clear them. So it's really 9 points you're talking about having to make up on LA. I can't imagine the Kraken being, even if LA's 500 the rest of the way, right? Like the Kraken then really have to win significantly to make up that gap. I don't know that that's going to happen. It's the same situation with the other two teams. I don't know. I guess Nashville's the one that could most conceivably be caught, but it's not great.
Right. And I mean, they play Nashville. They play Nashville next Saturday. You have that one game. You have one game against LA on April 3rd. You have 2 games against Vegas.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, the biggest swing you could help you make for yourself. But yeah, and it's interesting too, because that was one thing that Ron Francis was talking about this afternoon, was all the work that he and the staff basically have to do that goes into the trade deadline that informs whether they're going to sell, whether they're going to buy, basically their entire strategy. And he said we're in the worst spot to possibly be in going into a deadline,
Yeah.
because you're on the outside looking in, but you're close enough.
Hmm.
And it's just a bad spot to be in, because you have to then make all these calculations, right? Okay, what's our remaining schedule? How difficult is the strength of schedule? Who are our opponents? Who are we chasing? What do their schedules look like? How often do we play them? And they weigh all of this stuff. And I'm sure they have some kind of formula or something that they use that dictates, whether or not you're going to buy or sell, and to what extent, and what their odds are, what they think their odds are as far as making the playoffs, right? We see all these publicly
Hmm.
available models, for playoff odds that we cite quite a bit. I am sure the Kraken have their own kind of private model that determines, what their playoff odds are, and I think they act accordingly. And so I think you can see that in the decision to trade Wennberg, but to keep
Hmm.
Schultz, to keep Tatar, and to extend Eberly, is that, maybe they certainly don't feel like it's guaranteed. Otherwise, you wouldn't sell Wennberg, but there's still somewhat of a chance, so you didn't sell everybody off.
Yeah, well, and we talked about that when Wenberg was held out on Monday, right? Was it signaled that the Kraken must internally feel like the best move for them to make is to transition into more of the selling side of things, just because you have to assume they considered a possibility of winning both on Monday and Tuesday and putting themselves in a better spot, and they still came to that conclusion, because otherwise you would play Wenberg, right? You're not as worried about him getting injured, you're not as focused on trading him. So I still think long term that they said, look, the odds are not in our favor. They are stacked against us. We need to operate as such. And I think that they did that. I think, like, again, I think Eberly, it was always going to be that he stayed. I think with Justin Schultz, the defenseman market just didn't end up being a thing, right? Like, it's the first offseason in forever that I can
Yeah.
think of where it just wasn't a thing for some reason. So I think they kind of got, screwed there a little bit. But I think that ultimately all along the front office made the call Sunday, Monday, whenever it was, that, you know what, this probably isn't happening this year regardless. And that's why they went ahead and started working on the Wennberg deal. They held him out of those 2 games. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about yet, RJ, we haven't talked about on a deep dive, because we recorded before the first game where Wennberg was out of the lineup. Kraken looked really good without him, right? Transitioning Jared McCann over into center on the second line. It's kind of rounded out the depth scoring problem that the Kraken have had through this year. It seems to have helped, Andre Burakovsky being down on the Yanni Gord line, Oliver Bjorkstrand playing up on that second line with Jared McCann. A lot of the issues that the Kraken were having this year seem to be disappearing, at least offensively, right? With the change of not having Alexander Wennberg in the lineup. I mean, do you think that in and of itself is maybe something they weren't totally counting on, but now that you see it, you have, belief in, like, look, if this team can score goals, that's been their issue all year. They can maybe outscore and find themselves in a spot where they can catch a Nashville, or maybe if things don't gel well for Vegas right out of the gate and they continue to stumble for a little while, that becomes a possibility.
Right. I think it's possible. And yeah, I don't know that they even really saw that coming, as far as just how well Jared McCann would kind of click as a 2C. They know he can do it. Like, we've known for years that he's capable of sliding into the middle. But the way it's brought the whole lineup together, I think, was more than we could have really expected. And Hackstall did talk about it the other day. He says, there are trade-offs to when you move a guy like McCann to center. He can't focus as much offensively. He's got to play lower in the D zone. He has to do all
Mm-hmm.
those things that a center does. And he's great at doing that, but it does limit him a bit offensively. And I mean, I don't think we've seen that a whole lot in the last 2 games. And of course, the 2 shorthanded goals are going to kind of cloud our judgment a little bit.
Yes.
But you got to remember, those are shorthanded goals. They don't happen very often. They're
Well,
not at 5-on-5s. Yeah, go ahead.
but that's partly because he gets more playing time shorthanded because Wenberg's not there.
That's true. Yeah, including him on the PK. Absolutely. That's a change that I think has helped the PK and helped it be more aggressive. But you're not going to be scoring shorthanded goals all the time. It's just
Yeah,
those are
no,
hard to predict.
yeah.
They're hard to sustain. So, we can't count on that going forward. But if you look at 5-on-5, there is that trade-off that you make. And over a stretch of maybe 20 games, you might not see as much offensive production, even though it's gone really well for these first two. But hey, I mean, if it clicks well, then it clicks well. I think they are playing a little bit differently too, as we've pointed out over these two post-game lives that we've had, where there's less of a focus on there being just kind of one shutdown line that's usually Wennberg's, where you go out and for a good chunk of the game, you just try and make sure that nothing happens. You can get away with that against teams like Calgary and the Jets, where I don't think they have, a superstar that can beat you, but you may not be able to get away with it against other teams. So we'll kind of see if you can replicate it against, other squads. Obviously tonight is not going to be any different because you're playing the Jets again. But when you get to say Vegas next or some of these other teams, is that going to be an issue?
Yeah, if it just means that the second and third line, because again, this also just it coincides with the changeup of Berkey and Bjorkstrand, right? Kind of flipping roles. Bjorkstrand going to the second line, Berkey going to the third line. That's helped wake up the third line, in a way that it's kind of needed this year too. I look at the situation for Seattle. They're fifth worst in the league in terms of goals scored this year. Right now, this isn't goals scored per game. I'm just looking at total goals scored this year, but I don't know that it would actually change looking at it. So they're fifth lowest in goals for this year. Anything that adds, say, half a goal a game to their situation, given how well their goaltending has been, and Philip Grubauer has continued to play extremely well right now. Joey's looking good again. That's a huge difference, right? If you get half a goal a game more down the stretch, that's massively different for this team as far as where they would end up. And so I don't know. I think it still matter. And I think on the PK, this is also where them being in this kind of bubble spot of what do you have to lose kind of becomes good, because you look at both of those PK goals for Jared McCann, they're both breakaway opportunities, right? He's kind of cheating on those. But he can, because why not, right? You have nothing to lose if you're the Kraken down the stretch. You can sell out on the PK and have Jared McCann cheat up in the zone if you want him to, because who cares, right? Like, you're not in a playoff spot. Your season's going to end in 20 games if you don't do anything. So you might as well go for it there. And I think offensively, they're also starting to get to that point where I think you're starting to see guys move around a little bit more in the offensive zone. They're not staying as stationary. They're not worried so much about positioning. The defensemen are starting to activate more than they have in 40 games, right? And I think it's because the idea is starting to hit the team, whether it's coming from the players or the coaching staff, of this is YOLO time, right? We've got nothing to lose. We're on the outside looking in. The only way we can get there is if we, outscore the opponent night in, night out. Our defense is picked it up. Our goaltending has been fantastic. Let's just go for it. And it's kind of interesting because the goaltending has not been there in the past for the Kraken. We've never seen them in this situation. They've also never been on the playoff bubble the way they are right now either. But I do think that that's going to be something to pay attention to down the stretch as well. Is just, I think we're going to continue to see things like Jared McCann cheating up on the penalty kill, because you can afford to let him do that, because you need to win games. And if that's what it's going to take, you do that. I think in the offensive zone, we're going to see more chances taken, because you need to do that if you want to win games. And they're in a spot where they don't have anything to lose. And so as crazy as it sounds, RJ, even if they stay on the outside and they end up missing the playoffs by a couple points, I still think this next 20 game stretch for the Kraken, if they play that way, could be the most exciting bit of the season, that we see.
Right. It could be fun. And you know what? As I look at the schedule, I think they might be able to get away with that as well, too. Because when I was talking about Wennberg just now, before your answer there, I was thinking, okay, well, when is that next challenge going to be, right? As far as having a team with elite players that can really make you pay for that sort of thing. And of course, you see Vegas twice on the schedule coming up. But aside from that, Washington, no. Nashville, no. Buffalo, no. Arizona, Montreal, Anaheim, no. Dallas, yes. San Jose, no. LA, maybe. Flip a coin. Anaheim, Arizona, San Jose. Like, you look through the rest of the schedule, and these aren't teams with the firepower to kind of burn you on that stuff, as long as you don't do anything stupid and hand them goals.
Right. And so, again, the defense just needs just keep play in front of you. You did a great job of that against Calgary. I think that's the model. Keep play in front of you. Let Philip Grubauer or Joey Decord, whoever's in net, see the puck. I think the way Philip Grubauer, because we haven't talked about him about this anyway, but he is playing so aggressive, RJ. Like, he's even kind of in this more aggressive mindset where we're seeing him. He's really making moves before the puck has moved, right? He's seeing passes before they happen, and he's making that move to be there and be square to the shooter ahead of time. And because the defense is keeping the play in front of them, they're keeping teams to the outside, and they're allowing Philip Grubauer to have sight lines. It's also allowed him to be perfect when it comes to rebound control, which you need if you're going to be playing aggressive. You're going to be up at the top of your crease. You're going to be challenging shooters. You're going to be cheating on passes across. You need to make sure then you're not giving up rebounds, because if you give up a rebound in those situations, there's a ton of net behind you, right? There's the ability for them to walk around you. All of that stuff becomes a problem. But Philip Grubauer has just been a black hole absorbing pucks right now. And I think that that's something that we haven't seen from him in the past either. I think that there is just an energy around this team. I think they have embraced it. And I think the Alexander Wennberg move, right, just scratching him and keeping him out, knowing you're going to trade him, sent this message to the team. And this is the way that the guys have responded to it. And I think it's going to be really exciting. And I do think that if Vegas stumbles, right, because of, the fact that half their team's on LTIR right now anyway, right? Like you say, there's a challenge, right? But you're not going to necessarily have Eichel or Stone or anybody. If they stumble with the new acquisitions, if that just takes them a little while to get going, or if Nashville just completely regresses and they lose 8 of their next 10, that alone might be enough for the Kraken to just get in, essentially, RJ, on vibes.
Yeah, I like that phrase. Just get it on vibes, because that's really kind of what they're running on right now is the vibes after the Wennberg trade, and all the pressure's off. We talked about this on a previous post game, right? The Kraken benefited a lot last year from kind of that feeling of just not having any pressure expectations, and I think for the first time all season, it's kind of back. When you sell at the deadline, when you get rid of your forward with the most ice time, that sends a message, right? And one that you're probably not going to make the playoffs, but you know what? Why can't that be good for these guys?
It certainly seems to be the magic touch just based on last year, like you said, and what we're seeing from them right now. So it's going to be interesting. I just think that, despite the fact that we talked about the overall situation, there's some bleak stuff, in there. But at the same time, I think the way they're playing right now, it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. I think Kraken fans should still tune into these games because, the team's going to put on a show. And that's something we haven't gotten a lot of this year. And I think we're due. We're due. And it's okay to enjoy it regardless of where they are in the standings. I think it's going to be okay to enjoy it for these last 20 games. I'm excited for them. I know you are too, RJ. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks for joining us. Reminder that RJ's Armchair GM stream is this upcoming Sunday on March 10th at 7 p.m. over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey. Thanks to Queen Anne Beer Hall for sponsoring the podcast, as they always do. Again, everybody go check out their Korean barbecue burger of the month for the month of March. That's out now at both their locations, and we will see you all next time.
Hey everyone, before we go, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our awesome patrons over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, especially our Terror of the Deep patrons:
Absurdly Sane, Alaska Joe, Alex, Alvi, Andrew, Anonymous, Anthony, Beef, Ben, Brad, Bryce, Burnt Creme, Caden, Kat, Kaylin, Chandler, Charles, Shazzle Dazzle, Chip, Chris, Christian, Clutch, Cody, Connor, Coop, Corey, Danny39, Denise, DJ Singletone, Duthin, Evie99, Eli, Elizabeth, Empty Net Hockey, Ethan, Evan, Fusion Mix, Gaby, Gabrielle, Gary, Gregory, Helena, Habak, Jane, Jessica, Joni, Joseph, Josh, Joshua, Julia, Justin, Katie, Kepler, Kevin, Kitty B. Kraken, Cole,
L. Bell, Leanne, Levin, Light, Little Tennis Guy 8, Lonnie, Mac and Cheese, Maeve, Mark, Max, Maya, Michael, Michelle, Michigan Kraken, Nick, Night Drop, Noah, Nunya, Olivia, Paige, Patty, Paul, Rayanne, Randall, Rebecca, Robert, Rocklicker, Ryan, Sarah, Scott, Sia Kraken, Sean, Sergey, Sergeant Pickles, Shannon, Skeletal Tendency, Steven, Striatic, Tasty Kobold, Team 114 Chris, Ty, Virginia, Wendy, Where the Slovakians At, and Zoe. Thank you so much for making all this possible. We really appreciate your support.